Washington, D.C. is my home away from home. I've worked here for the better part of 3 decades as a founder, entrepreneur, policy expert, and author.
Probably the longest title. Everybody sort of shortened it to ONC for sanity's sake.
Mercifully.
Yeah, mercifully.
I've learned leadership secrets from many healthcare executives who understand that Washington is the largest payer and regulator of healthcare.
She said, well, because you'll never get a husband if you do that.
I began interviewing healthcare leaders many years ago because what better way to learn how they think, why they make it to the top, and how they remained there. Think about what was your most challenging engagement.
Healthcare has been the most difficult problem, I think. Let me just say that.
We'll talk about that later. What does a former naval aviator, foreign affairs expert with a specialty in counterterrorism, White House fellow, and head of a 500-plus student private school know about leadership? Quite a lot, actually. She is also author of What Girls Need, a must-read book for parents or anyone relating to girls and young women. Marisa left Harvard to fly jets in the Navy at a time when there were few women in naval aviation. She shared amusing and real-life stories about leadership lessons learned in the U.S. Navy. She interviewed al-Qaeda military personnel in the field for a research project. We discussed the risks and leadership profile for a Jewish American woman in that situation. Our conversation accelerated through leadership lessons gained during her time in the Obama White House to those learned as the head of an all-girl private school with the complication of managing through COVID. Marisa is a unique, engaging, energetic, and natural leader who shares her views on leadership in practical and intriguing ways. We wrapped up this fun and informative conversation by asking Marisa her advice to up-and-coming leaders. Well, good morning, Marisa, and welcome.
Good morning, Gary. Thank you for having me.
Great to have you at the microphone. We'd like to kick right in here with a discussion of your career and all the leadership you've displayed during that time, and then move to the book, What Girls Need, and you'll be publishing in softcover shortly. Needed to get that in so your publisher will like me, okay? But you look at your career, my gosh, after graduating from Harvard, naval aviator, you foreign affairs, cybersecurity expert, bunch of questions there with what's going on recently, and then head of a prominent private school, and an author. It seems like for most people, Marisa, you ought to be 100 years old, but I think you've just begun, so at any rate. We'll pursue all of that with an eye toward leadership. Why don't we start more or less at the beginning? What was life like for you growing up?
Part of the story from my childhood was actually growing up at the school that I now have the pleasure of running. So I actually went to school at the Baldwin School, the school where I'm now a head of school, the CEO equivalent. And for me, it was a really formidable experience as a young woman being in a community that was committed to, amplifying the voices of young women, helping girls see themselves as in any direction they wanted to go, whatever it was, the answer was, yep, of course you can do it. And, we've come a little far since that time. Things have changed a little bit, but, it is a powerful message to have as a young girl. And so that was a huge part of my childhood, and it sort of allowed me to explore a lot of I call it my choose my own adventure career. A lot of you dream it, you want to do it, try it. So that's a huge part of my story, is having that experience. And I think it actually influenced a lot of my both leadership style and career trajectory since then.
Well, what aspirations did you have, let's say, when you were at Harvard? Had you kind of scoped out some of these adventures that you'd like to pursue, or did that just kind of come as it came?
Well, I think I was the crazy one. I don't know, for those of you listening that you had that childhood dream and it was something along the lines of, firefighter, or, rock star, or, astronaut, jet pilot, right? So the latter two were mine, right? Like I, was never a really good singer and liked sports, but wasn't going to pursue that crazy dream. But for me, it was, I wanted to fly jets for the military. I wanted to, pursue sort of like NASA, aviation, aeronautics. That was my dream, and I had the good fortune of being able to, pursue that when I, was at Harvard, sort of in my academic landscape in terms of what my major was and the classes I took, and then, after I graduated. Pursuing it through the military. When I was in that part of my career, and we can talk to that at some point, I realized that I then had different visions of what happened next. But there was a moment where it was still the message from both my parents, my peers, and sort of the community that I grew up with saying, okay, childhood dreams, go for it. Like, it doesn't have to be as crazy as it sounds, and try it. And so that is, where or why I headed to the Navy next, because one of those things on my list had been fly jets for the U.S. Navy, fly jets for the military. And it, sort of proceeded from there. But that had been my dream, Gary. It was, from college, but I think it started when I was 8 or 9 years old. And it's a good, lesson for us to sometimes think about, like, well, what's passionate, right? What is the thing that, makes you excited to go to work, or, talk about and share stories about, and then figure out what of that you can then make part of your everyday career and professional life.
Well, you mentioned leadership and kind of tied it to your time at the Baldwin School. What would the young Marisa think about leadership?
Yeah, well, I think this is an interesting part of the story is as you grow in your career, and you know this, Gary, that you sort of see the difference between um, leading from the front, or leadership through the management lens, and leadership from a, how you get organizations and people to, lead alongside you and sort of really empower others to take a group, take an organization, take a team in a better direction. I think, that's something that you realize over time. It's something I often have a conversation with the girls here about, to start them thinking about, well, what is it, the difference of leading by being directive, leading by managing, the way it looks to lead a group or a club or a sports team or things like that when you're young. But then over time, you realize the best way to be a true, impactful, empathetic, powerful leader, in moments of crisis or moments of normalcy, is to really get the best out of the people around you, inspire them, and empower them. And that's where leadership really gets to, take off and go to the next level. So I think that's something that comes with maturity and experience. I'm sure that you talk about it with your peers as well, as like, how do you get the team around you to really, be their best? And that's where I think, leadership can go to the next level. And so I think that's, reflecting back, something that I wouldn't think any, young person would know or see just yet. And that would be the big difference between me now and then.
So, what were your parents like, and does your leadership style draw from your parents, do you think?
It's an interesting question. I saw, when we were talking about this earlier, it's one that hadn't occurred to me. And I'm not sure if my leadership style is so derived from my parents. And I wonder if, other parents out there, or other, how you reflect on your family influence. But I think the family influence is more of me as a person, and sort of my both style and in priorities. And I say that in a weird way to go to the one of the foremost lessons I learned from my parents that influences my leadership, but is about me personally, is my ability to handle and respond to failure. Right. And so the example that many people might have think of, like, failure when you're a kid or you're around your family, is the failure that comes on a sports team or a sports field when you fall down, you miss the big shot, whatever it is, and how you're taught over time to pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and keep going. Right, whatever version of that looks like when you were a child, particularly, early preteen, teenage years, and what the conversation sounds like in your family or with your peer group to say, hey, go back at it, go back in, don't worry if you missed the shot. I played basketball. You don't see me on Zoom, but I'm not built like a basketball player. I'm scrappy, but certainly not dunking anytime soon. More missed shots than shots delivered. But the message was always, okay, keep trying, keep trying. And I know when I finally made that shot and got the points for the team, it felt so good, but it felt so good because I'd overcome moments of failure. And I think that really influences my leadership style because it's how I, develop strategy for the organization. It's how I, develop my team to say, okay, let's think out of the box. Think about some crazy ideas. It's okay, it may not work, but we'll try it. We'll game plan it. And, if it doesn't work, let's protect ourselves against the risk, the downside, but we'll go for it. And I think particularly right now when we have so many moments that require us to think differently in the world, whether it's about responding to the pandemic, responding to new definitions of remote work, responding to new ways to engage people. We need to try new things. And the way that that plays out for leaders is to say, okay, team, it's okay to take risk and fail. That's fine because it's about how you respond in the moments of failure. So I think if I'm trying to connect the lessons of my childhood and how we as adults and parents raise the next generation, I think that's one of the things that influenced me most and impacted my leadership style now.
Let's build on this foundation and move to pick out various points in your career. Obviously, a lot of people when they're younger say, hey, I'd like to fly airplanes or fly jets. Probably many, many fewer actually do it. You did it. What was the sequence of events that got you into the Navy and into jets?
Well, I think, the starting point, and I'll be dating myself now, but there's probably enough people in the audience who this may resonate as well, to say the starting point was really crazy enough, like watching Top Gun when I was a kid. I can actually remember thinking that looks great, that looks awesome, and watching it a few more times and thinking, oh, this is what I want to try to do. I interestingly, at the time they didn't allow women to fly in combat, and this was, in the movie came out was late 80s, early 90s. It wasn't until the mid 90s that women were allowed to be combat aviators in the U.S. Navy. I didn't even realize that, but I thought I saw something that was cool, that aligned with my adventuresome side and my, love of, space and science and math and other things too. Great. And then it became a conversation, internally and with those around me, but like, well, what does that look like? I happened to pursue ROTC in college. So that means while I was at Harvard, I was also doing officer training in the summers or during the school year. And it meant that when I graduated, I commissioned right into the US Navy. And then it was, the standard, the training that you get in the military to prepare you to fly, stationed with a squadron on the West Coast, flying jets for the U.S. Navy off of aircraft carriers. Really exciting stuff. It was my living of the dream. It also provided me incredible leadership lessons in terms of how to, lead with small teams, big teams, in moments of true physical risk, emotional risk, under lots of pressure, and then find ways to move teams forward to a common goal. So I think it both satisfied that, dream I had as a kid, and also helped me realize a new dream of how to be a better leader, how to sort of manage teams at different moments. But that's sort of like the basic story of how it all played out. There's probably more details, including how I then transitioned from the Navy into other things.
Yeah, let's cover a couple of points. One is in terms of leadership, did you recognize right away, maybe even back at ROTC days, that this was going to be a terrific opportunity to learn leadership lessons, or did that just come along with it?
That came along with it. And I think some of the best lessons that we all gain, particularly as young adults, but throughout our lives and careers, are those ones that come as a surprise. Those moments where we look back and think, wow, that gave me a secondary benefit I didn't even realize. And for me, I have to say that my time in the military had so many secondary benefits I never would have thought. It sort of cemented my interest in national security, my interest in public service, my interest and desire to lead, and sort of my training in the leadership space. And so what grew from a passion for Top Gun and flying fast and cool things like that when I was a young kid really grew into something else. And this is where I often talk to folks and saying, okay, well, what are those personal passions we have that have secondary benefits we may not realize? We can reflect back in a lot of ways and say, oh, look, like, my time on a team playing a sport, my time, whether it's, doing plays at the local theater, like these other moments. And we learn really important things in those moments about how to navigate difference, how to problem solve, how to, get teams to work better, that I think have lasting impact on how we lead. But for me, it very much was something that I didn't realize till I was in it. And then it fed a different part of me that I realize now, has had lasting impact on sort of what I've done next and sort of who I am on a daily basis.
I'm thinking about the Top Gun 2, which they're apparently now making, and just thinking about, I'd love to talk to you after you see Top Gun 2 with all of your background. That'd be a pretty interesting discussion.
Yep. Well, I'm looking forward to that. I know I saw the promo came out. I think they delayed it because of everything that's been going on, but it's on my list too.
Foreign affairs, national security, what did occasion your interest there in government service? Was it during your time flying jets? You said, hey, I'd like to do this, or what actually kind of led you down that path?
Well, and this goes back to, it's a great example of that, interesting moments that take us different directions and we may not realize it at the time. But when we train ourselves to just grab something different, it can have sort of benefits you didn't realize. So what does that mean? That is a generalized way of describing a random internship I had when I was junior year in college. And I was interested in doing something different because I was in ROTC. I had, someone who put me in touch with individuals who in the Pentagon who handled, every service in the military, Army, Navy, Air Force has, a team that looks at policies with other foreign governments, how we relate to, the French Navy and other navies and how we work together. And I spent my summer working in that office. And suddenly I realized this is really cool. Right, this is having a different sort of impact. This is looking at the world in a different way. This is engaging with, I spent the summer talking with naval attachés and naval officials from all sorts of governments and seeing, there's a whole world out there. And that actually was how I pivoted from wanting to pursue NASA to doing something else in grad school and going a different direction. And eventually, when I left the Navy, pursuing national security and foreign policy in the government. And I think really the story there for others is we have these moments, these experiences. When we're young, it could be internships. It could be, just people we engage with, and have an afternoon conversation with, and we're like, wow, that was so interesting. And it sometimes opens doors. And I think one thing that I encourage to, as a muscle memory to build is, how do you then try going through that door? Because particularly in the world it is now, we can pivot a lot more often than ever before. Very few of us now have one career that lasts forever, right? You can change careers. I've changed careers more than most, but still, you can change careers. You can pursue different avenues within a certain industry. But one of the great ways to explore it is having these one-off moments and then taking it further. Again, for me, it was a summer experience that then I did for a second summer. And then I went, did a year of grad school to explore foreign policy and national security. And it turned to what ended up being a decade-long career, after my military service in national security and eventually counterterrorism. And it led me in a direction that I never would have thought when I was younger or even in school itself. And so this is where I encourage people to think, who are you meeting at a cocktail party? They're like, that's so interesting. How do I explore it? Is there something there that would potentially give me a different opportunity? And we live in a time where those kinds of opportunities can really translate into interesting career moments or interesting volunteer moments, in getting involved with different organizations on the volunteer basis, but just a chance to open your aperture and really build out both your career and leadership in a different way.
During that time, you were actually in the field interviewing Al-Qaeda members, and I'm wondering, one, how did that materialize? And two, you certainly have a capacity to take risk, it would seem. So I say that in a very positive sense. I mean, it's very impressive. But how did that story unfold?
So you're speaking to a specific story in the book, but a story that reflects a period in that portion of my career when I was handling national security and foreign policy, where I'd been for a couple of years working, in the federal government as a civil servant handling these issues. And then I took a step back, and that open door I saw, I walked through it and went back to grad school for a couple of years. And in that moment, I had the opportunity to go back into the field, into the Middle East, mostly in Yemen and Saudi Arabia, and also in Afghanistan, and to, interview locals. The topic at the interest area at my timers, or my area of focus, was counterterrorism and terrorism, specifically Al Qaeda at the time. In Afghanistan, I was interviewing, sort of those related to the Taliban, which were now as front page news yet again, unfortunately. And I spent the period of a couple of years going in and out of countries in the region, meeting with locals, meeting with those who had been former members of these terrorist groups or, non-state actors, talking with them about their experience, trying to understand their perspective on the world. It was, yes, sort of a crazy thing. It was a story. Those are the stories I didn't tell my mother until I came home and said, I'm back. This is what happened. But it was a lot of moments where, I saw a window of opportunity to do something that would feed an interest of mine, that I had enough skills, it would build other skills. And, for me, it was I could gather information that would have impact on other people. And so, for example, one of the stories I share in the book is about a meeting I had with the individual who had been the senior most recruiter for Al Qaeda in Yemen. And I had been based in Sana'a, Yemen, the capital of Yemen, for a number of weeks. And through meeting with people and introducing myself, I got connected with a network who made the introduction. And we sat down over tea. And we spent a morning together talking about his experience, talking about his time with Osama bin Laden and Tora Bora, talking about how, his perspective on the grievances, the issues, the why behind terrorist groups like Al Qaeda in the region. For him, he'd left the organization, so part of it was me understanding what it takes to convince somebody to leave these groups. And then the most interesting moment was when we shared back and forth to my perspective. And as with anything, these are the sort of intangible moments. I collected a lot of information from my book, information from my then PhD, but I also learned a lot of lessons about myself in terms of how to understand another person who fundamentally you have baseline disagreements with about the world and in so many ways. But that there are commonalities, and when you can find those commonalities, you can bridge gaps. You can find solutions. You eventually can, apply it in leadership ways to organizations. But so for me, it was a really powerful, those moments were very powerful lessons in how to communicate, empathize, and connect with those who, fundamentally, as a Jewish American young woman, we would never have been sitting down but for a willingness to find that common ground.
How do you view the cybersecurity issues that we're seeing more and more prominently now, be it Russian originated or not? Do you see that growing? Is there a way for us to begin to get off the defensive and play offensive here?
Well, so Gary, you're now speaking to, when I started looking at the major national security threats, and for a while I was focused on the issues of surrounding terrorism and our, and work in the counterterrorism sphere. And then when I pivoted from that work and joined the White House at the end of the Obama administration, I'm more focused on another growing then threat, which was in the cybersecurity landscape. And you're right, it fundamentally remains a major threat, issue, concern at all levels. I mean, I'm sure for those who are watching, you probably have seen news lately about, or watching or listening for those who are on audio, news reports lately about how, hackers and the cybersecurity concerns that are for private industries, even schools. I mean, one thing that I'm now looking at is how we shore up our world here at Baldwin to protect against threats against schools, because there have been some school districts and schools targeted, that they collect your information, they collect your medical files, they collect the data that you hold about your people. So it remains a growing threat, in the same way that we look at a lot of national security or just problems in general at any organization. It's about both defense and offense. It's about how you build the wall high enough. In the cyber world, it's about, multiple passwords. It's about, other ways that we protect our systems, systemically. And then it's about the offense. It's about what you do to train your people differently so that you're not clicking on phishing emails, or at the government level, how we do things to understand what cyber attacks look like at the state to state level. So it is, like anything, a good problem. You want to do both defense and offense to get ahead of it. But it's something that every leader, particularly in healthcare, really needs to think about closely, because, just like schools are being targeted, healthcare systems right now are prime on that list of places that are potential targets for cyber attacks.
Yeah, well, they have been, so you're absolutely right about that. Well, moving on, so at what point did you start thinking about becoming head of the Baldwin School?
The honest answer is not until they ask me.
Yeah, right.
Well, I mean, and this goes back to the theme of something earlier, that sometimes the most, impactful things we can do, most, fun pivots we can make, most, challenging and rewarding experiences are those that we don't plan, but that when we see, we go after. And for me, I had not thought about returning to the school that I will say that, in part raised me and that I owed a lot to. I was always involved as an alum. I always sort of kept an eye on what was going on. But it wasn't until, and I can remember this vividly, when I was in the West Wing. It wasn't until I was sitting in the West Wing, sitting at my job at the White House, and they were looking for the next head of school. My predecessor was retiring. They were doing a search. And I got that phone call. And for anyone who gets phone calls from their alma mater, I think you generally think, they're going to ask for money. But actually, they were asking to see if I'd be interested in returning to the school that where I grew up and leading this next chapter. And it was a fantastic opportunity. It was a crazy one. I actually recall running to my then for the women listening, you may have what's called a work sister. I think it's a great, so that sister you have at work, that woman you turn to, who you go and you frankly plan things together for professional reasons, and then go have happy hour afterwards. It's actually I think a fundamentally great tool to have in your workspace. And I went to my then work sister at the White House and said, "You'll never guess the call I just got." And she said, "That's perfect for you. You should definitely take it." Because she saw something that I didn't at the time, which is that this is a community I could give back to. It would be, a great leadership opportunity. It's a mission that I fundamentally really support. And so, yeah, I went for it, and lo and behold, here I am 5 years later.
If you look at your career, you are able to talk about it in terms of opportunities that come, and obviously you're substantially well prepared. Somebody on the outside, like me, looks at it and says, you are a different person than many. How is it that you're so unique, do you think?
Well, I'm going to challenge the "am I so unique?" Because I think we all have this in ourselves. I think, it helps that, you do have to be a risk taker, right? Because every pivot, every sort of moment where you go out and grab something requires that risky chance of, I haven't been in this sector before. I don't know what this is going to be like. Am I going to like it? Am I going to be good at it? Like, what does that look like? So it does take, getting used with taking risk, which is something that we all have in us. We just have to practice, right? Initially, taking risk may look like going to a cocktail party where you don't know people. It may take, throwing your hat in the ring for a job where you think it's a little bit a little bit crazy. It's like going to be a head of school when your world has been national security to date. But why not? Try it out, see what happens. But that's something we all have in us. We just have to practice and grow. And it's something I talk about a lot in my book, that we all have these core skills in us, but we really have to figure out how to, I say, make them superpowers, right? For me, one of my superpowers is the ability to take risks. I've learned over time that I can, sort of take a lot and sort of withstand a lot of moments of frankly, self-doubt, uncertainty, and just keep going and get to that point. It doesn't always take long. It takes a little bit of effort to cross over to the, nope, I got this, right? It's another version of the fake it till you make it. It's the, I practice that moment of getting through the uncertainty to the next point. So I guess I would challenge the, am I that unique? Or if I just practiced over time, a little bit unconsciously, but maybe consciously to some degree, those core skills that really help in this era of the world, I would argue, in this era of work, really help frankly, opportunities come my way. Because, Gary, just like the opportunities that came your way, we all work for it, right? They just didn't materialize. We all worked for it. And so anyone out there, you work for those opportunities. And then it's about how to take the leap and how to convince yourself to take that leap.
Yeah, well, that particular flow of thought definitely is captured in the book, which I thought, by the way, was just terrific. So why don't we move in that direction? I understand that you What really triggered your thinking about the book was a course in leadership you put together and gave for the seniors, I think, at Baldwin. Is that true, one? And two, what were the kind of basic thesis of that course that got you to think about the book?
So it's entirely true, and it comes from as Gary mentioned, I teach a seminar for the seniors at my school on leadership, and it's meant to be, frankly, fill a gap that I think I didn't have when I was young, and then I wish I'd had, and start a conversation that I don't think many young people, but particularly young women, don't get early enough. The idea of what does it mean to be a leader? What is the difference between our earlier conversation being a leader and a manager? How does being a leader look differently if you're a woman, if you're a person of color, if you're of a certain background from a certain area in the world, pursue a certain industry, whatever it is? And then talk to very specifically skills, talents, things that help you be an effective leader. We've talked about a few of them: how you communicate, how you problem solve, how you take risk. And I think these are all skills that we can grow over time. And so what ended up happening is, during the course of creating my syllabus, having the conversation, sharing personal stories with the girls in the school, I realized that there was something here that I wanted to share more broadly, not just with the girls at Baldwin, but with other women, with parents, with educators. The book is geared to multiple ages, right? It's for teachers and parents, but also for young women who want to hear stories about what it takes to be a good problem solver, and what lessons I learned problem solving in the Navy versus, the White House, that help me now as a leader be my best self. So it fundamentally came out of those conversations. I thank the students here for helping push me in that direction. But it also is because I think, and I would, wonder for particularly the women listening today, what lessons did we not hear when we were young that we wish we'd heard? Because I can point to a number that, I learned over time in my 20s, the early stages of my career, but I think we all would benefit from hearing them again and helping teach the next generation.
Well, one of the lessons was find a voice. And I thought that, I'll let you talk about it. It's going to be more eloquent than I am. But one of the things that stood out to me was, not only do you need to learn to ask, but you need to learn to get. And that distinction, I thought, was remarkably important. But now I'll turn it over to you, Marisa.
Well, so this is one lesson that I think we talk about abstractly a lot with women at a certain point. This, how to use your voice, what does that look like personally and professionally? And I realized over time that it's a lesson that I'd heard a lot, but not really internalized most effectively. And this is where a story is the best example, right? I always heard, raise your voice, use your voice. And I think, that is part of the women's empowerment movement. We hear that a lot in terms of how we raise our young women. But in the reality, there's a lot of moments, even as what I thought was a confident, empowered woman myself, there's a lot of moments when I was, sitting at a table with mostly men, whether it was in the military, on an aircraft carrier, in the West Wing, where I didn't speak up as loudly being a euphemism for, speak up when I really wanted to, as often or as impactfully, persuasively as I could have or should have, right? One of the stories I share in the book, a moment that it all comes together, was, when I was in the White House working for President Obama. I was literally in my first meeting with the president, sitting around a small conference table across from the Oval Office. My first time sitting, two seats down from the leader of the free world. And in the course of the hour meeting, talking about national security, foreign policy, the issues that were my issues that I'd spent, a decade working on, either in the military or, in the field and, in the Middle East. Besides introducing myself at the start of the meeting, I didn't say anything. I let others in the room speak for me, ask questions, answer questions. And it wasn't until I left that I looked back and I was like, what just happened? Like, I never took my opportunity to raise my voice. And it was a startling realization that I had lost practice. I had forgotten that trait. I had not practiced it enough in certain ways. And there are specific things that we can do to practice using our voice, practice helping young women or women at any age. I still sometimes have to remind myself, because even as the head, the principal, the CEO of my school, when I'm with peers, I'm often with men who frankly dominate the conversation. There's fewer statistically, women of a certain age running schools these days. It is what it is. But how do I overcome that as a leader? And so, there are things we can do, and there's things that we can practice as adults, as with our children, to help use our voice and then make our voice most persuasive. Because another thing I realized in looking at both the research and my own experience is that one thing, not, it's a generalization, but the research holds it true, is that, by and large, women are less effective at negotiating, at being persuasive when it's about something that we need personally, whether it's salary negotiations, whether it's about, a title for a new job, whether sometimes it's even about negotiating that new position, that new responsibility in your current role. Research shows that, we aren't as persuasive, aggressive, effective, lots of different words for it, as our male peers. But there are things we can do to get at that, to fix it. The system should change as well. There's nothing, please understand that I think that there's systemic ways that, women have more barriers in this regard. But for the moment, there are also things we can do as individuals to help ourselves, help the young women in our lives. And so the book talks to a lot of that, because it's something that I learned over time. I didn't do as well as my male peers. Whether it's my first job out of the Navy, I realized looking around later, I was underpaid and overqualified, and how did I get myself in that position? Or whether it's what I see happen with the young mentees in my life now, where I'm like, okay, just ask. Let's see what happens when you try to negotiate. So those are some of the lessons that, again, the stories in the book tell, but that came from both personal experience and research too.
Well, that's a segue into another lesson, which is cultivate a competitive spirit, is the way you put it there. And you look at you, Marisa, and you say, well, there's somebody who's willing to compete. Good for you. But how did you think about that as far as the book was concerned?
This is one that I really speaks to the research that I delved into when I was, putting everything together for the book, and looking at, what social scientists say are areas of generalized strength, natural strength for women, and which are areas that, because of social conditioning, peer pressure, societal norms, women often don't as effectively lean into, as effectively make their superpower. So what does that mean? It means when you look at the research, or when you talk to parents, which is part of my job every day is talk to parents about what's on their minds. A lot of the conversations are about, how to make our kids, make our girls, less competitive, how to make them like not too aggressive, how to make them, great. It's about being better team players, and being a good competitor is about being a good teammate. But sometimes that translates into a conversation I've had with parents in my, in my network, to say, oh, but we don't play competitive games at home because we don't want to make her too competitive. And when you start looking at it, being competitive is a great thing. It's something that we, by and large, have our boys lean into. There is no conversation about having a boy lean back and say, no, like, let somebody else win, because you don't want to make someone feel bad. You don't want to, feel abashed or ashamed about winning or being your best. And what I saw over time is that there's a narrative out there for young women that plays out in really, really tangible ways, from preteen, teenage, all the way through early career moments, that says women need to account for the emotions of the other and then not be their best selves, right? This translates into girls by middle school, by about 12, 13, opting out of competitive sports, statistically speaking, 50% more than boys. And that by the end of high school, 2/3 of girls will have stopped playing in a team sport because of social norms and peer pressures. And, and yet you look at who makes it to the C-suite of almost any industry, and it's individuals who played competitive sports, who learned how to compete, because it's not about beating the other person. It's about being your best self. It's about being a good teammate. It's about being able to win and lose. And so this is where I looked at research and my own personal experience. I learned to win and lose on the basketball court. I learned to be a good teammate on the field hockey field. I learned to pick myself up and dust myself off in all those moments. And it really cemented what I think is an edge that I have now in the professional sphere. So, again, it's about applying lessons and research and personal experience in a way that's specific to women, and helping women at every age realize that being competitive is good. And how do we sort of own that in a really personally empowering way?
Yeah, well, my opinion on it is that the book should be required reading for every parent, by the way, with a boy or a girl. But what about the collaborative problem solving? You kind of make an interesting point that maybe girls have an edge there.
Well, so this is another interesting one that comes out of research, but then I think we all can sort of find it in our own personal experience too. And it's this recent finding or recent studies that show, well, let's take a step back. First and foremost, I think we can all admit or all see that being able to problem solve in teams is something that is fundamental to personal and professional life now more than ever. Right? It's how we work these days. It's how teams are built. It's, what we hire for, the ability to work and problem solve, not just with those, sitting next to you, but lots of different people, maybe across the world, but across, lines of operation in whatever, hospital you're running or whatever team you're leading. And that is truly, that will set you apart in a professional sphere and also in your personal life. Now, so with that, as like current and future workforces need problem solvers, whether it's to solve the pandemic, solve economic inequality, solve racial inequality, you need people who can solve problems across different lines of information. And then you look at research that says, it turns out, as a generalized, statistical truth that women are naturally better at problem solving in groups than are men and young boys. A lot of it speaks to how we're raised early on to work in groups, how we connect, how we think about things with the other in mind, how we communicate. But it means that by age 15, a study that was done 2 years ago by, no, now, we're now in 2021, so I'm going to have to backdate it, 3 years ago by the OECD that looked at 125,000 students in 52 countries around the world. Developing countries, developed countries, looked at teenagers at 15 years old, boys and girls, and said that, girls outperform boys when they did testing for problem solving in groups. Not a problem you solved on your own, but a problem that needed to be solved with other people. And it was, by an order of 30%, 40%, depending on the country, 30 points higher, 40 points higher. Girls were 1.6 times more likely to be top performers in this specific skill than boys. And it was something that developed over time naturally because it's not something we really teach now. So now what if we say, wait a minute, we know the workforce needs it, the world needs this kind of thinking and skill. We know it's something that comes naturally or, sort of is socialized in women from a young age. What if we pair those two ideas and say, hey, let's lean into it? For all the women listening, how are you such an effective collaborative problem solver, and how can that be something you think about, lean into, train to? How can we make our young girls realize that this is something they should be good at? So it's as impactful when they're getting their, lab report done, or they're, working on a problem in school, that they do a good job. But it's even more impactful to say, hey, how did you work on it with your lab partner? What happened when you ran into a problem with the partner on the project? What did you do about it? Did it work out? Those are the conversations we have here at our school, because it's a girls' school where we're focused on these sorts of things. But I would think it's a conversation we should all be having at all stages of our career to figure out how we make this core skill really, to use your word, a competitive advantage, an edge for women at any point in their career.
Well, as a longtime leader, I can tell you that it's been pretty easy to observe that 1.6 or 1.6 times is proficiency, because it's obvious when you start dealing with people on a regular basis that that's the case. Would you humor me? The one story in the book that I loved was the story of refueling your jet. You knew this was coming, right? Refueling the jet and the whole collaboration part of it. You told it in the book as an example of this, but could you share that with us, please?
It's a story that I didn't realize at the time, but upon retrospect, fundamentally speaks to this idea that I was naturally good at collaboratively problem solving, dealing, and that other women in my network, in my sphere, were as well. And so the story comes, that Gary is referencing and I speak to in the book, is a mission that mission underway when I was in the Navy, out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, miles, hundreds of miles from, the nearest land, the nearest airport, right? And when you're flying for the Navy, that's always the issue, right? Where is the nearest airport that you could land on if you have an emergency? And this was a mission at night. So we had night vision goggles on and we had to refuel. That was, one of the core things in the Navy that sets the Navy apart. We like to say it's part of what makes us, proud and excited about our mission is that we refuel. We take on fuel from another aircraft midair. And this evening we were having trouble. And so we were out in the Pacific, and it was myself and the plane I flew. The jet had one other, had a pilot, another navigator, the three of us in our jet. We couldn't take on fuel, and we didn't know what we were going to do about it. And what unfolds that I describe in the book is this moment midair where myself and my partner at the time, the navigator, beside me, was another woman. We were one of the very few women in our air wing. There was about eight women in our air wing of just under 250, and we had to solve an emergency midair, right? And when we open the emergency manual, when you go through the book mid-flight and you say, what are the next steps when you're having a, refueling issue midair in the middle of the Pacific, you get to the bottom, and if nothing else works, you eject, right? And that's the thing that you always want to avoid when you're in a plane is ejecting. Not a good idea. So it was about how do we get to the solution that's something different. And what unfolded was, very candidly, we followed the emergency procedures because those are the things that sort of set your foundation for how to address what was a dire emergency at the time. But we did it slightly differently. We communicated differently with each other. We thought differently about how to gather information, talk to other planes that were in the vicinity, talk to the aircraft carrier as we were heading back to land. I won't share the end of the story, but I'm here to tell the story, as is the other navigator with me, who's still a friend to this day. But it was a story that of two women collaborating, leading slightly different problem solving in a moment of high tension, high pressure, high risk. I didn't know it at the time, but looking back and talking through the story with her, I think we were so successful because we problem solved in together slightly differently than we would have if we, had maybe been boys raised differently, or maybe just not had this talent naturally in us.
Thank you for sharing that story. Let's wrap up the book. There's a number of lessons in the book, but let's wrap up with adaptability, which is if you listen to you or have listened to you over the last several minutes, you'd realize if there's anybody who's adaptable, it's you. But how do you describe that in the book to encourage others to be adaptable?
Yeah, so adaptability again is a skill, a talent, a superpower that we all need now more than ever. Whether you're thinking about remote work, about a pandemic, about shifting careers, it's something that we need as adults, that our kids need to learn from an early age. It's also something that I realize as a woman, and that for the women listening, probably affects us differently, personally and professionally, than our male colleagues. In the book, I talk about it at first through the lens of adapting to, moments of difficulty or challenge or just, change when I was out in the field in Afghanistan. When I was, struck with moments where I had to think differently about my next steps. When I was, in southern Afghanistan, in Kandahar, and there was, an attack by the Taliban, and I had to adjust my plans and adapt to what happened next and figure out how to stay safe. My mission at the time was meeting people and gathering information for my then dissertation, things like that. But Gary, I'm going to say, share a story that's slightly different than the book right now, to say that, I think the thing that has cemented my my desire to teach to about adaptability, talk about adaptability, and make it a superpower for particularly women is the fact that for many of us, when we become mothers, when we become parents, we have to adapt at a personal, professional level in a very different way than our male peers. Now, that's not true in all instances, but it is true for a lot of us. And I, know firsthand, having my son is now not quite 2 years old, so I have a toddler at home who's walking, babbling, and sort of doing all that fun stuff. But fundamentally, when he arrived, when I had when I had my baby, our baby, and I was finishing the book, I was running the school, I was doing all the things that were critically important and still are to me as a leader, as a woman, as a career person. I had this new part of me. I had to think differently about not just what my daily schedule would look like, but how I related to my partner, how I prioritize certain things, how I, dealt with the world around me. And I think that moment of adapting strikes a lot of professional women, a lot of women who are listening and are thinking about their leadership and what it looks like in a very, very personal way, in a way that's difficult, in a way that we don't often talk about. And so I think it's important to bring to this conversation because it does change how we lead, how we manage our careers, how we adapt on a daily basis in a really fundamental way. So that's part of what I talk to in the book as well, how we practice adapting so that when these moments come, that fundamentally life changes in this whole way, whether it's a child or a marriage or a divorce or a move or a loss of a personal nature, how we can adapt to that at multiple levels and still keep our personal and professional lives thriving.
What Girls Need is a must-read from my standpoint. It'll be out in soft cover shortly. So thanks for covering all that with us, Marisa. Is there another book in your future here?
I think about it. I like the book process, but I love this process even more, talking about it with others. And so I'll let you know. It's on the list.
Okay, sounds good. Another question. I have two more. One is your bucket list. Is there anything else on the bucket list that we ought to be prepared for here?
For those listening, I think there was a time in life where our bucket lists were things like, or for me, it was places I want to travel, running more or experiences. Fundamentally right now, after a year of running a school during a pandemic and dealing with the multiple crises that are facing our communities, having a toddler at home and all this stuff, I think my bucket list really is having moments with colleagues and with friends and that side of things, which I hope we all are paying attention to, because it's as important now as ever, as sort of reconnecting with the people in our lives that make us feel full. So that's, I think, my bucket list for the moment.
We have a number of up-and-coming leaders in our audience, and I'm sure you're asked all the time for advice, leadership advice by young people, but what is the essence of your leadership advice?
There are a few core skills and talents and I speak to them in the book, that will make you, the most effective leader possible, and that you can grow them. And that's it's the voice, it's the problem solving. At the end of the day, it's about how you're empowering others around you. Because all these skills really, they're about you as a leader, but they're really about how you reflect and support your people to make sure your people are their best, which makes you your best leading self. And so I speak to a lot in my book, but it's through the lens of, that is what being an impactful leader is. It's sort of making others be their best, and so you and the organization and the team move forward. And so, I think even as we're talking about these individual lessons, it's about how it connects you to others in a really powerful way. And I think that's something, it helps particularly for women to know, because it means you're not in it alone, right? Because at the end of the day, that's really what it's about. You're not in it alone. There's people out there who want to help, professionally, personally, and building that team will make you your best self, will make you a more impactful leader. So hopefully that will be the crux of it, I think. But again, it is all in this book, so thank you for mentioning. Out in paperback, August 3rd. Please pick up a copy, or head to my website, look me up, and shoot me an email. I love having these conversations, and I'm happy to continue them with anyone who has more to think about, more to say.
Well, I have my copy here too, by the way. So, but at any rate, this has been a tremendously engaging and enjoyable conversation, Marisa. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Gary, and excited to talk with all your listeners.